I remain an optimist because I've been doing this work for 25 years and I've seen how important the system is. I would like to see American leadership. I would like to see our government and our political actors sort of continue to take the lead. But absent that, I think there's lots of space for all of us to sort of reimagine what a more just and effective international system might look like. My name is Susan Farbstein, and I'm a clinical professor here at the law school and the director of the International Human Rights Clinic. My essay is called American Power and the Future of Human Rights, and it looks at a couple of things. It sort of starts off looking at the role, the really instrumental role that the United States has played in building the modern international human rights system that's flourished over the past 80 years since the end of World War II and protected the rights of millions of people around the world, including right here in the United States. And then it also looks at the moment that we're in right now, does really sort of an honest accounting of the fact that right now it feels like rather than engaging in the human rights system, maybe sometimes selectively or partially, but still engaging, it rather feels like the US is actually trying to actively dismantle the system that it helped to create. I start by looking back at the founding, and I note that one of the key principles of legitimate governance in the United States was the idea that fundamental rights would be protected. And as a young country, the US reaffirmed that it was going to play by the law of nations, what we would now call international law. And after World War II, the US played a really critical role in building the modern international human rights system. So Americans were critical in the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals that established the principle that individuals can be held accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The UN Charter was drafted in San Francisco with significant American input. Eleanor Roosevelt famously chaired the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which remains to this day the foundational text of the international human rights system. And I think over time, the US engaged in different moments in different ways with the system, sometimes selectively, sometimes hypocritically. And one example I point to of that is US behavior during the so-called War on Terror, when you saw torture, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances. So that's a clear example of the US violating international human rights and humanitarian law. But even in that context, American actors still tried to justify their actions by turning to the language of law. They still made legal arguments. In my mind, those arguments were often flawed, they were often strained, but at least there was some understanding that this is the system that we're operating in, that these are the rules that we have to comply with, and that our actions will be judged according to these standards. And what feels to me very different in this moment is that rather than engaging with the system, the US seems to be really trying to dismantle it, to tear it down. And in my essay, one example that I point to that sort of illustrates the current moment is a vote that happened in the UN General Assembly on the 3rd anniversary after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, where for the prior 2 years, the US had voted on resolutions that condemned Russia's aggression as sort of violating key principles of the UN Charter. But on the 3rd anniversary, the US didn't just abstain, it actually voted against a resolution that would have condemned Russia's actions. And in voting against that resolution, it joined with essentially pariah states in the international system: Russia, Sudan, Hungary, North Korea. But I think there are lots of examples we can point to of the US sort of not living up to its aspirations and ideals right now. So we could look at the boat strikes in the Caribbean. We could look at the way that the US has withdrawn itself from lots of international institutions, sanctions on the ICC, on UN special rapporteurs, threats to take Greenland and the Panama Canal by force, enforced disappearances, sending migrants to detention centers outside the United States, the war of aggression in Iran. I think when I look collectively at these actions, what it feels like is it feels like a dismantling. Having said all of that, I try to end the essay on a more positive note. One of the things that I say is that I think sometimes moments of rupture can be moments of reimagining. And if we look back in history, we've seen this before. So, for example, decolonization really reshaped the United Nations, or the end of the Cold War created space so that the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda could be created, and then that paved the path to the ICC. I think that global civil society has imagined modes of advocacy that would have been sort of incomprehensible at the time that the UN Declaration, the Universal Declaration, was drafted. So I remain an optimist because I've been doing this work for 25 years and I've seen how important the system is. I would like to see American leadership. I would like to see our government and our political actors sort of continue to take the lead. But absent that, I think there's lots of space for all of us to sort of reimagine what a more just and effective international system might look like. So that might be being led more by rights holders who have the most at stake. That might be a system where power is rebalanced and not just held by those who sort of dominated the world right after the end of World War II. That might be a system that thinks more about socioeconomic rights being on the same playing field as civil and political rights, or a system that thinks about atrocity prevention and not just accountability after the fact. So that's my hope on the 250th anniversary.